Thanks. Welcome, everybody. We're on the site for our second panel, and our chair for this panel, our chair for this panel is Mr. Masungo, and we'll be receiving presentations from Dr. Bertha Kibona and Dr. Tiffany Banda. This panel is under the thematic category of the pandemic and African higher education. I'll hand over to Kura right now.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second session. And our presenters for the session is Bertha Kibona and Dr. Bertha Kibona and Dr. Tiffany Banda, and our discussant is going to be in Nkhoma. So we will start off with Dr. Bertha Kibona, who is a postdoctoral researcher with the Higher Education and Human Development Research Group, and with a background and training in finance and investment analysis. She has developed an interest and a passion for the value of investing in university education from the Tanzanian context. Her research interests include, among other things, the significant opportunities of universities generated through the ways in which universities train and produce graduates to become contributors to their development, as well as that of their families and communities. And her presentation today is going to be on higher education research and knowledge production within the COVID-19 pandemic, evidence from South Africa. Over to you, Dr. Bertha Kibona.
Thanks, Kura. I should say this doctor thing sounds so weird. But thanks, Kura, and good afternoon to everyone. So as Kura said, I'll be making a presentation on research and knowledge production within the COVID-19 pandemic using the account from South Africa. So just a head up, this is a project which is funded by Codestria. So I had an opportunity to work with this amazing people here. There's Sam, there's Prof. Omar, there's Prof. Ishmael Munene, and Ntimi, who is part of our research group. So to give an introduction of our research on what we are trying to do and what exactly is the problem, which I think the keynote speaker in the morning kind of made a solid introduction to my research or the project that I'll present today. As he indicated that, I mean, we're all aware now that the pandemic has affected all communities around the world, regardless of race, nationalities, level of education, income, or gender. Same way the pandemic affected different sectors without leaving out education or higher education sector. And so in this regard, some of the research that have been done in South Africa, they were mostly looking at the effect of the pandemic in terms of employment, in terms of tourism, health sectors, where not really much has been looking at higher education, specifically looking at research and how researchers have really experienced during the pandemic in regard to the knowledge production and the daily duties of research. So most of the research that have been done on higher education regarding the pandemic were mostly looking at the teaching and learning. And so we thought it would be interesting to see to what extent the pandemic has really, if it has, affected the aspect of research and knowledge production, knowing that research is also part of the functions of the higher education. And even aside from that, the literature shows that even before the pandemic, there are some challenges that have been facing the research function of higher education. For instance, issue of funding towards research. So there's Kigotho shows that this is his paper on from 2021. So he shows that all African countries were among the 80% countries from worldwide, which they only invest 1% of GDP, 1% of their GDP on research and higher education. So we thought it would be interesting to see, okay, so these are the challenges that have been existing even before the pandemic. So what has the pandemic really done to research and knowledge production within higher education sector? And the reason why we decided to narrow down our study and focus on South African context is by understanding that in as much as all of African countries only allocate 1% of their GDP in research, South Africa is exceptional because it has the highest proportion of it has the highest proportion of GDP in research. As you can see that from 2014 to 2018, the rate kind of increased from 0.77% to 0.83% of GDP to research. And also, as you can recall, when our keynote speaker this morning was giving out the data and information on the COVID-19 cases, number of positive cases, and even number of deaths. So we can also recall that if we were to compare the countries in Africa, South Africa has had the highest number of cases in terms of COVID-19 infection in the continent. And also South Africa makes a significant amount of research output from the continent. As you can see, there's about 87 out of 101 African journals, which comes from South Africa, which says a lot that South Africa does contribute to significant amount of research output. So with another example is with the Arua project, in which they argue that out of the six members, which are the South African universities, these South African universities contribute to about 73% of the total population, of the total publication in 2018. So out of the members of Arua, majority of the total publication comes from the South African universities. And also South Africa has the highest doctoral enrollment and graduates, which gives us a potential case study to see to what extent the pandemic has affected research and knowledge production, especially in this context where there's high contribution to publication and significant amount of research and even funding towards research comparing to other African countries. And so these are the research questions that we tried to answer in our project. So the first question looks at how has the COVID-19 disruption affected and shaped research and knowledge production in Africa? And also the second question is looking at how did researchers in South Africa adapt to the disruption of research during the COVID-19 pandemic? And the last question that we're looking at, it's basically looking at what are some of the emerging lessons and opportunities arising from the COVID-19 disruptions of research and experience of researchers. And to answer to our research questions, we first looked at the desktop we did a desktop review of literature. So we were just looking at the literature that is out there that is speaking issues to do with pandemic and higher education and research, specifically in South African context. And also we did some semi-structured interview. So with the articles or the literature that we worked with, the first search that we did a search using keywords including COVID-19, pandemic, higher education, universities, and Africa, which gave us a total of about 738 articles. And just to highlight on this, we did this desktop review of literature and semi-structured interview last year, December. So this was done December 2021. And the time phrase that we were looking at our literature was from 2020 to December 2021. And so after we've had the keywords on COVID-19, pandemic, higher education, universities, and Africa, we had about 738 articles. And so since we wanted to narrow it down to South Africa, we then replaced Africa with South Africa, and it gave us about 262 articles. But to remember that our focus was mainly on research and knowledge production. So we added our keywords, research and knowledge production, which we had 110 articles. So after we've read mostly the abstracts or the introduction and conclusion of these articles, we came down to 12 articles, which were specifically looking at higher education, COVID-19 or the pandemic, and issue to do with research and knowledge production, specifically in South Africa. And with the semi-structured interview that we did, I'll show the table of the participants that we had just now, but just to explain the sampling that we did to get our participants. And the reason why we decided to do an interview or to add interviews to our study was that we thought there's not really much that has been written in regard to the effect or the implication of the pandemic in research and knowledge production in Africa. So rather than just using the articles or the literature that is there, we thought it would be useful to bring in empirical data by doing interview with these researchers. So by sampling, we first had to do interview with the researchers that are available and willing to participate. So that's convenience. We were just looking at their convenience. And also we were looking at the critical aspect of the participants or researchers that we are doing interview with by making sure that these are senior and experienced researchers. So it either can be a senior researcher or their experienced researcher. And also we tried to make a maximum variation by making sure that these participants are coming from different institutions, they have different gender, and also they're coming from different academic disciplines, just to have a sense of, to have a representation of each group, each institution, and having different disciplines. And the analysis that we did content and thematic analysis, in which so two researchers read and came up with two different themes from the articles, and then we met with the group to discuss about the themes that emerged, and the same thing with the interview. So we met and discussed about the theme that we emerged from either our articles or the interviews, and if we agree or if we don't agree. And yeah, I'll present the themes that emerge in the findings shortly. So this is our research participants, which are coming from different institutions and different fields. As you can see, we had researchers. So for instance, with the researcher number 1, we all referred them as researchers, because even if someone is a senior lecturer, like researcher 1, they still do research. So we all name them as researchers, regardless of their position, either researchers or lecturers. So as you can see, they're coming from different disciplines. We have Faculty of Natural Science, in which researcher 1 was coming from Geography department. We have the second participant, who is from Health Sciences, Mechanical and Engineering, and we have Education, have Literature and Language Studies, we have Psychology, Natural Science, Sociology, and Education. So we tried to get participants from different disciplines. So with the finding, or what came out from our participants, and this is not only from the interviews. So basically, the findings that I'll present today are the findings that came out from the review of literature and the interviews that we did. So the first one was the issue to do with research funding priorities. So what came out really strong from the review of literature and even the participants themselves was that, so during the pandemic, it was obvious that the funders kind of changed their funding priorities. Even if we, let's say, another example that I may use is our project itself, that Codestia gave us a condition, I'll say, that we need to incorporate, if we want our project to still be funded, we'll need to bring in issues of COVID-19 and the pandemic. Otherwise, your project wouldn't be funded, or you have to wait until they decide that, okay, now we are ready to give you funding, you can do something else. So this was something that came out really strong from even other participants, that the funding priorities have now changed and the focus has been more on the pandemic and its effect. And so one of the implications of this, as Mohammed Bai shows, is that the increased interest in COVID-19 related research has further constrained other research funding. So there's a lower chance to get funding if your research is not really, if your research has nothing to do with the pandemic. So most of the funders preferred to give funds to those projects or studies which are looking at the implication of the COVID-19. I included a quote from one of the participants, and who they say that there have been some funding opportunities from different organizations focusing on COVID-19. We managed to get some fundings from the planning department. This was a participant from the geography department. We were looking at the implication of COVID-19 in the informal settlement. So you can see that we got funding because the project had some elements of COVID-19. I see that many other calls for proposals are mostly on COVID-19. So I think COVID-19 has enabled funding opportunities, especially for COVID studies. So one of the implications that came out in terms of funding in research was that there was more funding if your project has something to do with the pandemic and its implication. And another finding that came out was the issue to do with technology-mediated research opportunities, in which this includes the opportunities and also the threat that the technology kind of imposed in doing research and all other opportunities that came with during the pandemic. So one was the changing forms of collaboration and partnerships. We're all aware that when the pandemic happened, the lockdown, social distance, so we had limited movements. We did not have enough space, or even we couldn't travel to like do research or even all sorts of collaborations, let's say the conferences, seminars, and all the things that we used to attend, or the activities that we used to do before the pandemic. So one of the threats that the pandemic brought was the limited space and traveling opportunities that we had. But also, another positive thing that the pandemic, or we had to adjust and learn during the pandemic, was that the use of technology and the use of technology. Because now, even if we couldn't travel, we still had a chance or opportunity to collaborate and do all these partnerships online. So this researcher indicated that I think the whole virtual collaboration and exchange of ideas should be taken seriously. Because speaking for myself, I believe during the COVID-19 pandemic, I was able to attend so many webinars. I was able to gain a lot of knowledge through these webinars. So I think that one way that research can be enhanced is through the adoption of technology, through virtual workshop and webinars. We are not running out of physical meetings, but I'm trying to say that some things can be done virtually and still have powerful effect in terms of sharing ideas and knowledge. So this researcher was talking about collaborations and partnerships that can be done or can be done through online. But we had another participant who was not included, his coach here, but for him, technology kind of allowed him to do research even in other countries. So his research is based in Zimbabwe, but he's based in South Africa. So even without traveling, he could still communicate with people in Zimbabwe and arrange some activities in Zimbabwe in relation to his study. So the technology did give us some other opportunities to engage online, even without traveling, with the limited space that we had. And also, the second thing which has to do with technology, with the issue of research methodology. So most of the researchers who couldn't travel or couldn't no longer do face-to-face interviews because of lockdown or social distance moved to online interviews and all online focus group, or however, if it's survey, just to mitigate the threat of the COVID-19, but also keep on pushing their project. But also, apart from the fact that technology gave us opportunity to continue with our research by doing these interviews online or collecting our data online, to some of the researchers, online opportunities or access to technology was also a challenge. So this researcher indicated from his experience that most of my research is qualitative and face-to-face for data collection. I've suffered because of the limitation of social distance and lockdown to mitigate the risk of the virus. It's worse dealing with poor communities and Black working class townships. The participants told me that they don't even want to try to engage online because their phones are not like ours. They don't have smartphones. So even if you could give them data, they will still don't have necessary tools for online meetings. So for this researcher, it was hard for him to even continue with his data collection or with his research because he works with poor communities in townships, and most of them don't have internet. They even don't have smartphones to say that, okay, maybe we'll have a Zoom meeting, or it was hard because these people don't really have the necessary tools. And another finding that came out was issue to do with research productivity, which was very interesting because one, with the practical aspect of conducting research, the findings shows that it was hard for most of researchers to balance between work and life in balance now that everyone was working from home. And also the time allocation on teaching and learning, research, and other responsibilities. So most of researchers felt overwhelmed and huge amount of work to really focus on their research, which kind of limited their research productivity. So this researcher indicated that our sales were delayed by this pandemic. For instance, one student, the one student we had delay in his research for over 6 months because we had no permission to access campus. This has also affected his financial status because funders want to see reports and progress. He went into depression because he couldn't cope. There was so much that one had to deal during the pandemic. So apart from the workload that most of the researchers felt that were limited, but also another issue was to do with access. So remember, some of them couldn't really do interviews or go for data collection. And also some of them had limited, if you were working from laboratories at some point, we did not have access to campus, and we did not really have access to data. Another interesting thing is that it's the opposite of this, because some of the researchers who did not really have, let's say, teaching or other administrative responsibilities felt like during the pandemic or lockdown, it gave them extra time to focus on their research, and they had really enough time to focus on their research and be really productive. So I can't really read the quote because of time, but basically this participant was just indicating how much time he had during lockdown and how much which enhanced his productivity and how much he has produced during the pandemic because he had extra time. Another issue that came out was the issue to do with gender inequalities. So I think the keynote speaker this morning kind of touched base to issues to do with gender, but what came out for us was that we've had much complaints or limitations from the female researchers who, for them, it was really hard working from home and being caregivers, taking care of the family, and yet you have other responsibilities that are waiting for you. You need to produce, you need to collect data, and some of them has other research, supervision, and other administrative responsibilities. So it was even harder for the female academics to really produce and be productive during the pandemic. So even though the pandemic has affected everyone, it was more like the female researchers were it was even worse with the female researchers. And the last finding that came out really strong for us was the issue to do with psychological challenges or mental health challenges, I think this was also mentioned in the morning with the keynote speaker. So most of researchers indicated that it was really hard for them to really focus because some of them were away from their families, and others was just the uncertainty of the pandemic on either, am I going to be fine? Am I going to catch the virus? Am I going to die? Hearing all this number of deaths, hearing all this number of positive cases. So for many of them had really stress, which limited their performance or kind of limited their work, because there's always this tension, or what's going to happen? Am I going to be fine? Am I going to catch the virus? Am I going to die? Am I going to be able to travel and see my family? So yeah, so that was the last finding. And so I'll just go quickly because I know I'm almost out of time. From this finding, so the observation that we made observation in terms of 3 levels. We made the observation in terms of 3 levels.
For interjecting, Bertha, you, I think I'll just give you 1 minute to wrap up. It's actually time up.
Okay. So we've the observation that we have made are in 3 levels in terms of micro, which looks at the systematic level itself, and then meso, institution, and individual level. So generally, the observation that we have made is that what the pandemic has done was only to show what has really been happening even before the pandemic, because none of the challenges that the researchers reported were not new. Issues to do with funding, issues to do with workload, or psychological challenges have always been there, but what the pandemic did was only to highlight and show us that these are the challenges that have always been existing, or these are the challenges that have always been facing the pandemic. And so overall, what we think is that higher education, and I think this replies to Daisy's question this morning. So there's an opportunity to address these existing and emerging challenges facing research and knowledge production on the continent, and even within each nation specifically, either to do with research or all the challenges that higher education faces in broad. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bertha, for the wonderful presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Tiffany Bandam, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of the Free State. She holds a PhD from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Her research was titled Exploring Lived Experiences of Academically Successfully Low Socioeconomic Background Students in Malawi's higher education. She is a recipient of the Cambridge Trust Award that saw her pursue her Master's in Philosophy degree at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Her research interest areas include social justice, human rights, access and equity in higher education, and development, and education for sustainable development. Her presentation is going to be on student learning experiences during COVID-19, a case of a university in Malawi. Over to you, Dr. Tiffany Banda.
Thank you very much, Kura, for the introduction, and thank you all for participating in this colloquium, and particularly in this presentation. And as Kura has already mentioned, the title of my presentation this afternoon is higher education experiences during COVID-19, and my focus was on the cases of disadvantaged students in the University of Malawi. Next. Next slide. Sorry, my device is playing up, so I've had to seek help with the presenting. But from my side, I
just given you control. Can you take over and see if you can move the slides?
Okay. Can you see the second slide? Are you able to see the second slide?
No, we can't, Tiffany.
All right. Can we try a plan B? Because I also sent the.
I moved it forward for you.
All right, because I had a plan B where I sent the presentation to Dr. Ojo to see if he can do it from his side. So if probably Bertha would stop the presentation and see if it will work with Dr. Ojo's sharing.
Tiffany, I'm seeing the second slide.
You're seeing the second slide. Yeah. Okay, so
yes.
that's the outline of the presentation. And am I the one moving the slides, or are we able to see the third slide?
No, have you moved the third slide?
Yeah, it's on slide number 3. Oh, Bertha, could you
just try to move those slides themselves? So when I navigate, I can move to the slides actually. So I'm moving them myself and I can see them as you speak. So when you say next, I click next and I'm able to see it.
All right, so is it okay if everyone can just move the slides from where they are? Silence means everything is fine, is it? So do I continue? All right, good, I will continue. Okay, so just as a background to the paper, as the presentations have gone since morning, what has come out so clearly is how the onset of COVID-19 initiated changes that caught the world by surprise. And this was especially so because of the alarming rate at which the coronavirus spread, which led to measures being taken to try and limit or to try and control the spread of it. And most of these measures that took place were mainly aimed at limiting social contact, as it was one of the major ways through which the virus spread. And so one of the results of the measures that were taken was the partial or complete lockdown in many parts of the world. And the education sector is one of the areas that was not spared with regards to these measures that were taken. And so in most countries of the world, students were ordered to leave their institutional campuses and begin a new life remotely, working from home and doing their learning from home. And so next slide. So while the need for intellectual stimulation is looked at as one of the primary goals of education, there are other needs that education also is considered to fulfill. For example, the need for socialization, which comes about mainly through interactions and particularly physical interactions, which has always been part of the education as a system. So for example, from the time that I started schooling in primary school, I've always known school, or I've always known education as me going to school, learning, but also being able to interact with friends, being able to interact with the educators and people like those. So the social aspect of it is also a big part that education has had to play. And so the aim of this paper was to therefore explore the students' learning experiences amidst these changes that occurred, because the major change that occurred with COVID-19 was the shift from face-to-face teaching and learning to the remote, the online one. So the aim of this study was to see how students experienced this change, and more especially those students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so my paper had 3 guiding questions. So the first question was, what was the experience of students with the unexpected changes made in their teaching and learning during COVID-19 pandemic? And then the second question was, what challenges and opportunities did they encounter with this change? And the third and final question was, how have these experiences affected their lives as students, but not only as students, but as students from disadvantaged backgrounds? And so one of the first things that I decided to do in writing this paper was to come up with a working definition of learning, because learning seemed to have been the central part of the paper that I was doing. And so from the various definitions that I read about regarding learning, I decided to use Ramsden's definition, which looks at learning as the acquisition of facts, skills, and methods that can be retained and used as necessary. And further to that, Lin and others looked at how these acquired skills, facts, and methods could either be used for intrinsic purposes. So one would acquire these skills just for the sake of acquiring them, or they would be acquired for extrinsic purposes, which would be used as probably a means to an end. So you want to achieve a higher goal, so you have to go through acquire these skills to achieve whatever it is that you want. So I used this definition as a working definition for what learning was going to mean in this paper. And then moving on to literature and what literature has said about the learning experiences during COVID-19. One thing that comes out so clearly is the general acknowledgement of the global disruptions that COVID-19 caused in learning. And so in looking at the disruptions, the level of disruptions or the gravity of these disruptions, I kind of figured out or was able to extract various factors that determined the gravity of the disruptions that COVID caused on learning. And these ones took various forms. There were a number of them, but I've just picked out a few of them. So the first one is locational factor. And locational factor, in most cases, it talked about the difference that it made in terms of whether you were based in the global north or in the global south. And the justification or the understanding against this was the fact that the global north is looked at or is considered to be more progressive, more developed. And so in terms of the idea of online learning, a good number of institutions within the global north had already been working, or the plans of migrating towards online learning was something that was already in the pipeline. But on the other hand, if you look at those institutions in the global south, it's something that we probably talked about it, but not as something that was to be implemented in the near future. And so the coming in of COVID-19 meant we were pushed into something that we hadn't prepared for. And so in terms of how COVID-19 disrupted, the global south seemed to have been affected more than the global north. And then the second factor that came out was the issue of socioeconomic factor. So with the migration from face-to-face to online learning comes the cost implications with regards to internet connectivity, the technology, and all the devices that are involved in the whole process. And so whether it was in the global south or in the global north, this idea or this socioeconomic factor did affect people at individual level, regional, or even institutional level. And then the third factor that came about was the underlying digital gap that exists between students as well as individuals from the global north and global south. And again, it goes back to the first factor that we've talked about. Because of the level of progression in the global south, there seemed to be more exposure to digital technology than from the south. And so when there was this change to migrate to online learning, the challenge was for most people in the global south because of the lack of exposure to digital technology. Can we all move on to the next slide? And then the last one that is also tied to the previous one is the prior exposure to digital technology. And so, as we all know, digital technology has been in existence for quite a while, but then the rate at which one is exposed or one adopts it depends on where one is, the level of their development, and also those other factors that we've talked about, for example, the socioeconomic status of a person. And in developed countries and also in the developing countries, digital technology has been seen to revolve around, the exposure has been seen to revolve around generational issues. So you see that there's a generational gap in terms of adoption and exposure to technology. So you find that most of the older generation tend to struggle to manage digital devices or digital technology compared to the younger ones whom Prensky has described as digital natives. And I think it also came up in the keynote presentation where you have this generation that is exposed to technology, that is so acquainted with what technology is all about. And on the other hand, you have these ones whom either because of age or because of lack of exposure have been looked at or described as digital immigrants. So they're just coming into the system and trying to negotiate what digital technology is all about. On to the next one. And so having looked at these the aspects of the pandemic and learning, I just wanted to bring in the context of the study, because I won't assume that we all have information or we all know about what Malawi is all about. So on the map at the far right corner, Malawi is just that tiny speck, the red speck on the map of Africa, and it is categorized as one of the least developed countries in the world and within the southern part of Africa. And as a country, the economy of it is mainly dependent on agriculture and mainly on tobacco, growing of tobacco. And with the restrictions against smoking, the anti-smoking campaign, the economy seems to be suffering even more. And then in terms of poverty levels, 51% of the population in Malawi is looked at as being poor or living beyond the poverty line. And 45% of the population, it comprises of young people who are 15 years old and under. And as a result of this, a large section of the population comes from deprived and disadvantaged backgrounds. And in looking at development and levels of development of countries, there is also the element of inequality. So the gap, the discrepancies between the haves and the have-nots. And for Malawi, the Gini inequality index is 45%, and that is quite wide, where you have the majority of the population being on the other side, where they have little or nothing, and you have a minority of people who own almost everything, or the bigger part of the economy. And in terms of access to electricity, Malawi's access, or the population that has access to electricity, is about 18.2, and majority of whom are live in urban areas. And the reason why I bring in this idea of access to electricity is because with the changes that came out with COVID, when students had to go back to work from home, there was need for electricity. For online learning to occur, you need electricity, you need internet, and you need all those things. So this thing had a play in the way technology, or the way the pandemic affected learning among the disadvantaged students. And for the theoretical framing, I decided to use two theories. So I used Maslow's theory of humanistic learning, which others also call Maslow's hierarchy of learning, hierarchy of needs. And I used a capabilities approach. It's my first time to use it, but I found it quite interesting. And so with Maslow's theory of humanistic learning, the emphasis is on the fact that human needs are arranged in a hierarchical order, and for one to fulfill higher order needs, there is need for them to have fulfilled the basic needs. So you can't, the chances of you going up in terms of acquiring or meeting the needs that you have in life are based on how well you fulfill the basic needs. So that's one of the lens that I decided to use for this paper. And on capabilities approach, the focus is on the extent to which human beings can fully attain what they want to be and to do. And capabilities depend on resources or conversion factors that facilitate realization of functions, or what one aspires to become and to do. And so for this study, my focus was on how students' capability to learn was affected by COVID-19 in their quest to realize functions of progressing to the next level, whether it be them moving from one year to the next, or them attaining their degree. So it was from these two theoretical lenses that I framed my, my study or my paper. And in terms of methodological approaches, I used a qualitative methodological approach where the idea was to go in depth in terms of understanding of the phenomenon. So the phenomenon around COVID and learning against students from disadvantaged backgrounds is what I was seeking to explore. And then I used case study as my research design. And with regards to the data collection methods, I used semi-structured interviews. And because of the, as Bertha had just spoken in her presentation about how researchers had to adjust with COVID-19 on how they were going to still go on with research and collection of data aside or outside of physical contact, I made use of the WhatsApp platform, and I was able to interview 16 students, both from postgraduate and undergraduate. And both these students were picked on the basis of their background, the level of disadvantage. And in terms of analyzing of my data, I used thematic analysis. Next. So in terms of the findings, after going through the transcripts, I categorized the findings into 3 parts. So the experiences that the respondents gave were in those 3 categories. So the first category was the pre-lockdown experience. So this was on the onset of COVID prior to shutting down of the institutions. And then the second category was during the lockdown experience. So the students have been let to go home and to operate from home. And the last category was the post-lockdown experience, which is the return of the students to face-to-face teaching and learning. And so I decided to, from the findings, I came up with that word cloud, and those are some of the things that came out so prominently in the responses of the students. And I'll try to explain some of these briefly. So one of the things that came out was the idea of the feeling of abnormality. So most of the students talked about how just after COVID-19 had set in and they were still going to class, they did attend classes, but there was this feeling of abnormality, and this came up as a result of what they got from social media. So there was one that talked about how they kept on hearing how people were falling like flies, dying like flies from this virus, and this created some sense of unease in them. And one of them talked about how, as a student, they had to attend lectures, but while they were attending lectures, what happened was they were present in the flesh, but in every sense of the word, they were absent because of all these things that were up against them in terms of what they got from social media and sometimes what was happening around them. So they would see people fall sick, catch the virus, and some of the people lose their lives. So it was a situation where most of them were so uncertain, and the element of fear also came out so prominently. And for most of them, what was interesting about the responses of these students was that while some of them talked about fear for their own lives, the major part of the respondents talked about how they feared infecting their loved ones. So like one of the respondents talked about how they weren't so worried about them catching the virus because they thought it was their responsibility, or they were the ones that were responsible for doing it, either by not following the protocols or something else. But the feeling of guilt of having to infect their loved ones is something that really affected them. And so in looking at those responses and the students' reactions to this experience and against the idea of learning following Ramsden's conceptualization of learning, one would then question, or one would then argue as to whether the ultimate intention of learning was achieved. So it's debatable as to whether in the presence of all this, the lack of concentration, the fear, the anxiety, one would really acquire those skills, methods, and knowledges that would help them to succeed or to use for either intrinsic or extrinsic uses. And then again, looking at what transpired from these pre-lockdown experiences, what came out so clear was that in looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you find that most of the things that were a concern to the students were things that touch on the basic needs that Maslow talks about. And probably learning would be looked at as a higher need, probably the self-actualization of the highest need. And so for these students at this point, even though coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, for them, getting an education was one way of getting out of poverty. And so it's something that they cherished. But faced with the threat, with these issues that threatened the core of their being or their survival, led to the overriding of the higher need, which was to learn or to self-actualize. Moving on to the lockdown experience, again, there are some issues or some words that came out so prominently, and some of them are the ones that are that came out on the word cloud. And for the lockdown experience, the first one of the issues that came out again prominently was the sense of relief. So for most of the students, after experiencing the pre-lockdown teaching and learning setup where there were all these fears, people are dying and they are hearing of all these bad things that are happening. For most of them, there was a sense of relief or being liberated and free. And one of them explained how they now felt free to decide on how to look after themselves. Whereas when they were in this setup, in the institutional setup, they had no choice. They knew they had to learn, but then the cost of learning would be something that would eventually probably cost them their health or their life. So there was some sense of relief, a sense of liberation and freedom. And I think that's the quote that I just talked about.
Tiffany, sorry, you are late with 5 minutes.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So COVID-19 was also considered as a hindrance from freedoms or a freedom limiting factor into the realization of their capabilities to learn. I'll have to rush. And then there was the unexpected inconvenience. And then again, it goes back to the gender aspect. So for most of the students that experienced or explained or expressed inconvenience were the female students. And one postgraduate student explained how frustrated they became because of the failure to juggle their roles as a mother, a wife, and a student. And so working from home, being enclosed within this space where they have their families, they have their children, was something that they struggled to deal with. And then there was a struggle of working in isolation, the frustration with technology. So for some of them, because of where they were located, internet connectivity was difficult. So they had to travel miles just to get to a place where they would get internet. And it wasn't even a guarantee that the internet would be reliable. And so because of that, some of them ended up missing out on much of the learning. And then the monetary issue came out as an experience as well, where most of them, even though some of the institutions provided data allocation, once they ran out of data allocation, they just had to depend on others and get notes handed over to them. And this decided in a lag in terms of their performance and way of catching up. And I'll quickly go to the post-lockdown experiences. So for the post-lockdown experiences, the one thing that came out was what I called the first things first. So when talking about what the experience was with the getting back to face-to-face teaching and learning, what one would expect would have been the excitement of, oh, we are in class, we are back to face-to-face, the excitement about teaching and learning. But for most of them, it was the idea of getting back to this social setup where they have their classmates, they have this support from their groups and their peers. And then the sense of relief, and again, the sense of relief comes in. So there was this sense of relief after when they were sent home, but then when they got back home, there was another sense of relief of saying, at least now we're able to go back to teaching and learning. And so one of them talked about how just seeing the lecturer stand in front made their day. So that was something. And then the other thing, because when I interviewed them, I asked about if they were able to identify anything positive that came out of it. And for most of them, the idea was that while they struggled with technology and all these other things, the positive thing that came out of them was most of them had become technologically savvier, that they were able to acquire skills which probably, if COVID hadn't happened or if they hadn't migrated to online learning, they wouldn't have been able to achieve this. So that's one of the positive things that came out of this. So in terms of final thoughts, COVID-19, on the most part, had adverse effects on learning experiences of students in the study. And while attending higher education is an ultimate goal for many of the students coming from poor backgrounds, as I've already said, it's looked at as a way of getting out of poverty. But then looked at in the face of a threat to their own survival, this higher need of self-actualization or getting an education, becoming someone, got a bit blurred because of the threat that was posed to the essence of their living. And then COVID-19 and the changes that accompany the pandemic had significant constraining effects to the extent to which disadvantaged students were able to access and develop their learning as capabilities, as well as development of other capabilities. So the capability to learn was affected by COVID-19 and because of all these other factors that we have mentioned about. And so while education is looked at as a capability, but also an opportunity to develop or to access other capabilities, this was restricted because of all these experiences that these students have talked about. And then my final thought is, it's a long reading, but I'll read as it is. So as a fertile functioning that education and learning is considered as, the evident inequalities that COVID-19 brought to surface, either as a result of access to an internet or the unreliable electricity among disadvantaged students in the study, created a barrier to the well-being, freedom, as well as agency that could only be described by Walker as being antithetical to education as a capability. And that is where I thought I should leave you at. And thank you very much for your attention. And I hope, Cora, I'm within time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tiffany, for the presentation. Yeah, you did it on time. Thank you very much. Now I hand over to Nkhoma, who's our discussant.
Yeah, thank you, Kura. And thank you for the presentation, the two presenters, Dr. Bertha Kibona and Dr. Banda. Yeah, listening to the presentations and when I saw the titles of the presentation and the theme of this session, I couldn't help but reflect on my own experience as an upcoming researcher and someone who is doing a PhD during this pandemic. As you might know, or some might want to know, that I started doing my PhD in 2020. So I arrived in Bloemfontein at the end of January in 2020. And as I was settling in this new environment and trying to learn what he was running ahead, and apart from the natural concern that I had about pursuing the PhD, in mid-March, the lockdown happened. So that's brought a whole new experience, and I had to adjust to new challenges that this pandemic brought. So these presentations that I've just made and the area presentation by the Dr. Ojo just relate with my experiences. So I just wanted to dwell on that. I don't have much questions, but just to talk about how I relate to the experiences. So the first presenter, Bertha, said that the COVID pandemic just compounded the already existing challenges. So even to myself as an individual, the challenges that I had in pursuing the PhD, thinking of how I was going to pursue this PhD, was more compounded by this pandemic. So in 2020, I had just moved from my family. I was here in South Africa, so I was worried about myself. I also was worrying about my family, and this problem made me to reflect on what really I valued. So I looked at my life in a whole different way, because I understood that during this period, I had to stay healthy in order to see my studies through, but which I also considered important. So I was like caught in a midway. Do I maybe just leave this thing and stay concentrate on my health, or do I continue pursuing this PhD and achieve what I imagine my life to be after a PhD? So I decided to stay, but I had the option of going back to Malawi and continuing the studies online. But as Tiffany has said it, the option of going to Malawi would mean going into a different way. So I know Tiffany touched on the difference between the global South and the North, as the North being more advantaged in terms of technology. But there was also disparities between South to South. So as I was here in South Africa and I wanted to move to Malawi, but I looked at the technology that I was going to leave behind and going to Malawi to do this PhD, there were whole new challenges that I was going to encounter. So now I'm here in my third year, having stayed, but I still have questions that I'm asking myself. I did this PhD in a different environment where I had to be alone, solitary most of the time, away from my colleagues. I asked these questions: have I thoroughly been trained? Have I really gone through the experience that a PhD student is supposed to go through? As Tiffany was saying, as the learning that he was supposed to happen really happened. But what really stands out, what we need to agree is that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way we do things, and it will continue to change. What we just need to ask ourselves is how is the higher education going to operate in this new space, so that its role as the knowledge producing entity and ensuring that the students that are classified as disadvantaged are not left behind. But on a disadvantage, I think the pandemic has also is making us to rethink how we talk of disadvantage. So I understand Tiffany tried to describe or to set the scene in Malawi where she did her studies, but she also rightly said that the pandemic affected people differently. Some were could be considered the disadvantage because of their age, the way they are to adjust to the use of technology, and some way could have been classified as disadvantage because how it affected their mental health. So even myself, in my own experience, where I was doing this program during the pandemic, I kind of asked myself, where I would submit maybe a work, and every little achievement that I would make was applauded. So I kind of asked myself, was this being applauded because I achieved it in a difficult situation that the pandemic brought? Did that dilute maybe the richness of the project that I was doing? So these are some of the questions that I'm asking myself, and I think the presenters can help to come in and solve some of these. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, for the response. I now hand over to, we've got questions on the chat box. I will be reading them. I don't know, for the presenters, Dr. Bertha, would you like to start off with addressing Andrew's comments, or you want to start off with the questions? the chat box.
Thanks, Kura, and thanks, Andrew, for your reflection on your experience and some of the findings that we have presented. So I think I'll respond to Judith and Chimomo's question. So with Judith's question, well, I wouldn't want to generalize in terms of online data collection and considering the quality. Okay, no, I wouldn't want to generalize between online data collection and the quality of research, because I think to some extent it depends. It depends with the type of research that you're doing. Because from my understanding is that for some researchers who managed to do their fieldwork or data collection online and everything turned out to be fine, they wouldn't really argue about the quality of online methods. But also, I think it only affects those ones who will have challenge in terms of having access to technology. For example, the example that I presented, that for a researcher who is working with a for a researcher who is working with a poor community who don't have access to technology, they don't have laptops, they don't have smartphone, you wouldn't really expect them to give you the information that you're looking for. So that would be different compared to. So I think in short, I would say it depends, Judith. It depends with the type of research that you're doing in order to come with authentic findings and data that you're looking for. Chimomo's question, aside mainstream COVID-19 component into proposal, did you find any interesting pointers that speak to new funding opportunities for knowledge production? Well, I'll say no. So generally, apart from the fact that most funders preferred to fund the project that had COVID-19, that had to do with the implication, or if you bring in issues of COVID-19, the rest will only show that there's limited funding to research and there's limited funding to higher education. It's the same thing. I was reading the news, I was reading the Wachira's paper yesterday from University World News, and his title said, funders opt for sport, music, entertainment, not higher education. So only the title gives you an understanding that we do have a challenge of funding in higher education in Africa, and even in South Africa. I wonder if I've responded to Chimomo and Judith. Kura?
Yes, okay, thank you. I think you can move on to, we can move on to Dr. Tiffany's responses. Dr. Tiffany?
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, Kura, for the sharing. I would probably seek your assistance with reading if there are any questions in the chat section, because my screen seems to have frozen, so I can't access. I think I have missed all the messages from 17 minutes past 12. So all the messages that came in between, I can't access. So if there's any question that is addressed to me, I will be happy to respond to. But just to respond to what Andrew had said, I think it's really true to look at like even the conceptualization of disadvantage itself, to say in most cases when you look at disadvantage, you mainly look at being disadvantaged from a point of view of probably the socioeconomic element. But as Andrew just said, with the COVID-19, the onset of COVID-19, it revealed other dimensions of disadvantage which need to be looked into as well. And just like Dr. Ojo in the morning talked about, mental health would also be considered as that. And there's just the importance of the need to demystify all these things and to look at them in the perspective that they're supposed to be looked at in, as a way of trying to resolve, even at institutional level, ways of resolving these issues once they have been properly reconceptualized. So I agree with that. And yeah, so Cora, if there's anything that relates to the presentation, if you'd assist with reading the questions, please.
Okay, there's one comment from Zungu. Let me read. The two theoretical lenses, Maslow and capabilities, that is in brackets, used made for a better understanding of how COVID-19 has affected the socio-economic status of people, mainly those coming from the global south. Thank you for an excellent presentation. The second one is from Chikosa. Great paper. I wonder whether you also looked at student coping strategies in the post-lockdown period, which was characterized by blended learning and resource pooling. And then the other one, that's the two presentations highlight the struggles faced by female academics and students because of gender inequalities in the broader society. It would be interesting to see future research more explicitly exploring such disadvantages in higher education, taking into account both races and gender. So I'll hand over to you, Dr. Tiffany, to respond to Chikosa's question.
All right. In terms of the element, the coping strategies for students, I think that's one of the areas that I would want to move into. So that's like a step beyond this. So after looking at the experiences, we've looked at the experiences, we've looked at the most of which seem to be negative. Of course, there is the opportunity that came out of it, but then in the face of all these experiences, I think based on my belief or my strong conviction that there is always, even in the midst of negativity, there's always ways in which people find ways of fighting or working against the odds. And so probably the next stage would be to focus on those areas to see how these students managed to cope, because at the end of it, what came out of it as well is the fact that in spite of all these things, because these interviews were being done after they had returned to face-to-face teaching and learning. And so what was interesting to note is that in spite of all these challenges that they had been talking about, even though some of them mentioned the idea of maybe contemplating to withdraw or to drop out, they didn't. So it would be interesting to see how they managed to, what made them go on, or what made them to fight on and to manage to endure this period to get back to face-to-face teaching and learning. So that's one thing that that would be looked at. And I also agree with the other comment that talks about doing more research to shed more light on these gender dimensions and how the effects of COVID-19 affected females more, because in the keynote presentation there was the idea of mental health affecting females more than males, and then in both Bertha's presentation and my presentation, there is always also the gender dimension, to which it seems the effects of COVID-19 seem to have been felt more on females than males, and it might come out as that, or it might come out as something else. So I think an in-depth or a follow-up on such a study would be an interesting way forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tiffany Banda. Are there any other questions or contributions from the floor?
Kura, there's a question.
There's 2 more questions in the chat.
I can't see them from my side.
Kura,
yeah?
Kura, I think I can, this one popped up. So it's from Zanele, and it's talking about how collection of data was done using WhatsApp. So what happened was, of course, you had to go through the routine of getting ethics approval and things like those. But then what I did was, in order to identify these most of these students, I had to go through the administrators to identify those students that would be considered disadvantaged. And most of the how I was able to do this was from the knowledge that I got or the experience that I had doing my PhD, because my PhD was also on disadvantaged students. So we used the same criteria that I used when doing my my PhD, and I was able to identify these students. But this time around, I chose to have a mix of the undergraduates and the postgraduates just to see what the dynamics were like. And so in the database that I got, they have the students' contact details and emails. So I sent communications to these students, explaining to them what the paper was all about and whether they were interested to take part in it. So when they showed some interest, I had to ask them if it would be possible to, because the WhatsApp was the most convenient one, if we would do the interviews via WhatsApp, and 16 of these students were agreeable to it. So we just set up a time and a place. Of course, I had to reimburse them for the data that they used for the WhatsApp calls and those minor expenses. But then it was quite possible. And Zanele is asking whether it was audio or video. It was audio because video is more costly. So it was audio, and I was able to connect it to my recording device. So I was able to record the whole interview, and that's what made it easier to transcribe and so on. So I hope I've answered your question, Zanele.
Tiffany, there's also another question from Chimemwe, who asked if there was any noticeable variations in resilience displayed by undergraduate and postgraduate students during all the 3 different phases that your research focused on. So was there a difference in resilience between the undergrad and postgraduate students, or was it more or less the same?
All right. So in terms of resilience, I would say most of the responses that alluded to resilience came more from the postgraduate students, because for most of them there was this idea of I've come this far already and I can't give up, even though there are these hardships. Because for most of them, they were secondary school teachers that had to raise funds to fund their education. So what kept them going was the fact that in spite of all this, their focus was on getting a better life for their families and for their families and for themselves. And so for them, they had, I think, this aspiration that they had of a better life ahead of them is what seemed to have pushed them even more. Whereas on the part of the undergraduates, this is where you got most of the sentiments that led that pointed towards wanting to drop out or just withdrawing until COVID ended, but then not knowing when COVID ended and what if COVID lasted for 10 years. So there were those variations in terms of their responses. And so if in talking of resilience and the variations, I think there was more indication of resilience from the postgraduates than it was from the undergraduates.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tiffany. Anyone, is there anyone who can see more questions on the chat box? Or anyone with more comments? Okay, we've got Dr. Mika Teko, whose hand is up. You can go ahead, yeah.
Thanks, Kura. I just had a question again for Tiffany about working with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the capabilities approach. So to kind of get a sense of how difficult or how easy that was to kind of work with these two very different theoretical perspectives, and I've not heard of them being used together in the same study. I also wondered if there are tenets of the capabilities approach, whether it's conversion factors, agency, and so on, that you did integrate into the broader sort of conceptual framework that then arose from your analysis. So it's a question around using these two. Somebody did say it made it clear, you know, using these two theoretical lenses together. So I just wondered what the process was like for you, if you could say more about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mika, for the question. It is an interesting one. I know you don't like the expression interesting, but for me, I thought it was my first time to use the capabilities approach. And in looking at the capabilities approach, I was looking at it from the point that, of course, I was looking at it in terms of the capabilities, the functions, and the resources or conversion factors that come in between that would either restrain or enhance one's ability to acquire capabilities. And then as I was going in, and when talking about the issues like what we've talked about on the issue of resilience and everything else, there was that sense of the agency on the part of the students that came about. And also in looking at that against Maslow's hierarchy, there were times when overall we would say the idea of Maslow's argument held on the most part, where these students found their ability or their quest to acquire the higher needs much more difficult. But then there were some students, for example, that would say, even though this is the case, I know I have these issues that are happening, there were these issues that are happening, but then for the sake of the greater good, I had to forgo those things. But the problem only came about when on the issue of the pre-lockdown issue. So where the issue was the threat to one's life. That's where there were the issues of, well, lack of concentration. And so on the most part, Maslow's theory held true to the idea of one falling into the temptation of foregoing the higher needs for once the lower needs are threatened. But also in other pockets, there was the sense of agency with regards to, in spite of what is happening, we'll still forge ahead, or we'll still soldier on. But then for me, as I said, it was the first time that I used capabilities, and it was quite interesting, and I'm hoping that I'll do more and just to see how it goes. But probably I'll after the presentation, I would have a one-on-one with you just to get what your feel was about it, if that's not an issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tiffany, for the response. Do we have more contributions? Okay, it seems like there are no more contributions. I think we can take an early tea break, and then our next session will start at 2:45. Thank you very much for the nice presentations from Dr. Bertha Kibona and Dr. Tiffany Banda, and the contributions from the floor. Thank you very much.